Welcome to the deep dive on the RTV Global Network. Today is Friday, July 17th, 2026. I'm your host, and joining me as always is our resident expert to help unpack the absolute complexities of our rapidly changing world.
Hey, great to be here. We've got a really fascinating stack of dispatches today.
We really do. I
Uh-huh.
mean, imagine an operating room where an AI-assisted robotic arm is performing pristine, futuristic surgery. It's like the absolute pinnacle of human innovation, right?
Right.
Now imagine walking out of that state-of-the-art hospital, driving across town, and stepping into a courtroom where an 11-year-old victim of abuse has been forced to wait 22 years just to have a human judge hear their case.
It's a staggering contrast.
It is. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're looking at a world and specifically focusing on the nation of Sri Lanka today that is technologically leapfrogging into the future, while its physical foundations and justice systems are, well, they're actively crumbling under the weight of institutional inertia.
Yeah, it's a profound paradox. I mean, it's really the defining friction of our current era. We're looking at a landscape where the velocity of technological and political change is completely decoupled from the actual capacity of the state to manage it.
Absolutely.
We have entire economies attempting this rapid digital transformation while simultaneously struggling to maintain basic liquidity. And global diplomatic channels are breaking down at the exact moment we need unified responses to macro-level crises.
Right, so let's pull on that thread of political velocity right now because the latest polling data out of Sri Lanka is genuinely staggering.
It really is.
President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, or AKD, has seen his public satisfaction rating surge to 75%. Yeah, that is a massive delta from the 42% of the vote he actually secured during the election. Meanwhile, Sajith Premadasa has slipped to 29%.
Which is quite a drop.
Exactly. Now, before we tear into the mechanics of this, I want to make our parameters very clear to you, the listener. Whenever we discuss political figures today, whether it's AKD, Sajith Premadasa, Ranil Wickremesinghe, Namal Rajapaksa, or international leaders like Donald Trump later on, we are strictly and neutrally reporting the data and statements provided in our sources.
Yeah, that's an important distinction.
We take no sides, we endorse no ideologies. We are simply analyzing the geopolitical and domestic chessboard.
Exactly the right framing. So analyzing that chessboard, going from a 42% electoral plurality to a 75% satisfaction rating, requires a fundamental rewiring of the electorate's immediate perception.
Right.
I wouldn't just call this a standard honeymoon period. A vote is a hard, binary, tribal choice. Public satisfaction is a softer metric. It's highly susceptible to initial, highly visible administrative actions.
So it's more of a vibe check.
Basically, yeah.
Right.
What we're likely seeing is the electorate exhaling after a deeply polarized election, granting a temporary, broad-based mandate of, let's see what you can do.
But that capital is volatile.
Highly volatile. Holding a 75% rating when the structural, highly unpopular macroeconomic mandates of the IMF inevitably bite the consumer well, that is the true stress test of this administration.
I would actually argue that 75% approval is almost dangerously high because it creates a mandate that is mathematically impossible to satisfy in a post-bankruptcy economy.
That's a great point.
But what makes that 75% even more potent is what is happening across the aisle. Our sources detail a complete splintering of the opposition. We have 66 members of parliament essentially wandering in the political wilderness, struggling for relevance.
Yeah, just micro-alliances battling to secure a localized future.
Right. I look at this and I don't see a functioning democracy. I see a legislative vacuum. If the opposition is shattered into 66 different fragments, how does any rigorous scrutiny of the ruling party actually happen?
Well, it doesn't, and that is the systemic vulnerability here. A unified shadow cabinet is not a luxury in a parliamentary democracy. It is the load-bearing wall of legislative accountability.
Okay.
When an opposition fractures into individual survivalists fighting over the scraps of a 29% polling share, you lose the mechanism that stress tests government policy.
So they just push whatever they want through.
Pretty much. The ruling party might find it incredibly easy to push through their agenda in the short term, but without a cohesive opposition tearing apart those bills in committee, you end up passing deeply flawed legislation. You create an echo chamber where bad ideas become law simply because there was no organized bloc capable of articulating a counter-argument.
And we have a stark reminder of what happens when the burden of leadership exists in a vacuum. Former President Ranil Wickremesinghe recently stated, and again, I'm quoting the reports neutrally here, that he never prepared alone to take over the nation in 2022, but that he took it on as his responsibility.
It's a fascinating retroactive framing of his legacy.
It really is. He's essentially reminding the public that during the total systemic collapse of 2022, there was no master plan, just a solitary figure stepping into the breach.
It's a calculated admission. By highlighting the solitary nature of that transition, he is attempting to anchor his historical legacy not to the specific policies he enacted, but to the mere act of assuming command when the state apparatus was in freefall.
Right.
It forces the electorate to remember the sheer chaos of that moment, subtly contrasting the stability required for strategic governance against the brutal daily triage of crisis management that defined his tenure.
Contrasting that retroactive legacy is a very forward-looking vision from MP Namal Rajapaksa, who is calling for Sri Lanka to position itself as a key link in the Indian Ocean century.
Which is quite a phrase.
Yeah, again, impartial analysis here, but that phrase is a heavy geopolitical pivot. It suggests moving the national gaze away from internal factional squabbles and focusing entirely on the macro trade routes stretching from the Malacca Strait to the Suez Canal.
The Indian Ocean Century thesis is economically sound on paper. The center of global economic gravity has irrevocably shifted toward the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
Sri Lanka's geographical positioning is arguably its most valuable, yet historically underutilized sovereign asset. But projecting a vision of maritime hegemony requires more than rhetoric.
What does it actually take?
It requires immense capital deepening, deep water port infrastructure, and a flawlessly executed doctrine of diplomatic non-alignment. You cannot be the nexus of the Indian Ocean if your domestic economy is paralyzed by foreign exchange shortages.
Which provides the perfect, albeit harsh, bridge into the macroeconomic reality of this deep dive. Because the Indian Ocean Century doesn't mean anything if your balance of payments is collapsing.
Right.
We have a KPMG report explicitly stating that Sri Lanka's IMF reserve target is under severe pressure. And we can see the immediate symptom of that. The Sri Lankan rupee is further depreciating against the US dollar.
Yeah, the currency markets react instantly.
Now, I understand the basic mechanics of import dependency, but for you, the listener, who tracks financial markets, unpack the structural fragility of these specific IMF covenants. Why is this reserve target constantly hovering on the brink of failure?
Well, the fragility stems from the inherent contradiction within the sovereign debt recovery model. The IMF mandates a strict accumulation of net international reserves to rebuild the nation's liquidity buffer and prove debt sustainability.
Okay.
However, Sri Lanka operates a deeply structural current account deficit. The economy fundamentally requires more foreign exchange to import energy, pharmaceuticals, and intermediate manufacturing goods than it earns through exports.
So they're always playing catch-up.
Exactly. When the central bank is forced to aggressively purchase dollars from the domestic market to meet the IMF's quarterly reserve targets, they artificially starve the local market of dollar liquidity.
Oh, wow.
And this supply-demand mismatch immediately forces the rupee to depreciate. That depreciation then makes the imported energy and raw materials drastically more expensive, fueling domestic inflation, which further slows economic output.
So it's a doom loop.
It is a highly restrictive feedback loop where satisfying the international creditor often suffocates the domestic engine required to generate the very revenue the creditor is demanding.
And the friction between short-term life support and long-term structural overhaul is glaring right now. On one hand, the outgoing Sri Lankan ambassador to the U.S. is signaling good news regarding major U.S. tariff relief.
Which sounds great on the surface.
It does. That is an immediate, localized injection of competitiveness for existing exporters. But simultaneously, the government just launched a national export development plan targeting $36 billion by 2030. You don't hit $36 billion just by hoping Washington shaves a few percentage points off garment tariffs.
Precisely. Tariff relief is palliative care, you know. It preserves the margins of legacy industries that are already operating at scale. A $36 billion export target, representing an exponential leap from current revenues, requires a complete metamorphosis of the industrial base.
What does that look like?
It mandates moving away from low-complexity apparel and raw commodities into high-value manufacturing like electronics, pharmaceuticals, complex IT services.
Right.
And that requires billions in foreign direct investment, a massive upskilling of the labor force, and a total overhaul of commercial law. The ambition is necessary, but the capital required to build that capacity is currently locked behind the very sovereign risk profile the IMF program is trying to fix.
Let's trace how that macro tension plays out in specific microsectors. The sources give us 3 distinct industry snapshots. First, the tea sector.
Okay.
Dilma is reporting a significant profit jump, which validates the model of exporting branded, value-added products. But the broader tea sector's recovery is completely bogged down by weakness in the largest producing regions.
Yeah, the bulk exporters.
Exactly. To counter this, they've initiated a 500 Ceylon tea villages program. It feels like the industry is split between high-end global branding and grassroots agricultural vulnerability.
It is a textbook case of the value chain divide. Dilma has successfully insulated itself from raw commodity volatility by selling intellectual property, a brand, a story, a premium consumer experience. Their margins are dictated by global marketing, not just weather patterns. The broader sector, however, is still trapped in the bulk export trap, leaving them entirely exposed to climate fluctuations, rising fertilizer costs, and global auction prices. The 500 Ceylon Tea Villages initiative is likely a structural intervention to stabilize the base of that pyramid, attempting to standardize quality and perhaps introduce localized microbranding to pull those rural producers out of the bulk commodity bloodbath.
Then we look at the gold industry, where the friction between local business and global economic mandates is literal. Sri Lanka is exploring the establishment of a local gold refinery.
That's a huge undertaking.
It is. And the catalyst for this: strict IMF regulations are delaying import tax relief for jewelers. So because the macroeconomic guardrails won't allow cheap importation of refined gold to protect foreign reserves, the local industry is attempting a massive capital expenditure to refine it onshore.
This is a fascinating example of regulatory arbitrage. The IMF's primary directive is to plug the leak of foreign exchange, which means heavily taxing or restricting the importation of non-essential raw materials like gold.
So the jewelers are just pivoting.
Right. The domestic jewelry sector, facing an existential threat from this supply chokehold, pivots to onshore refining. However, setting up a sovereign-level gold refinery isn't just about melting metal.
It's way more complicated than that.
It requires securing London Bullion Market Association accreditation, implementing massive anti-money laundering compliance frameworks, and securing incredibly complex logistics. It is an incredibly capital-intensive workaround to a temporary macroeconomic restriction. It shows how top-down monetary policy forces industries to radically alter their operational models just to survive.
And speaking of altering operational models to survive sovereign risk, we have Ceylon Energy. They are hosting an event called Energize 2026. But the critical data point here is that they are launching Apollo Energy on a Delaware, USA investment platform.
Delaware.
Yeah, now, Delaware is the global capital for corporate structuring due to its chancery court and tax efficiencies. But for a Sri Lankan energy firm to embed its new platform there, that looks to me like a deliberate strategy to attract foreign direct investment by legally insulating that capital from the domestic volatility of the Sri Lankan legal and financial system.
You are reading the structural mechanics perfectly. Global institutional investors are deeply wary of deploying capital into jurisdictions with recent sovereign defaults or opaque regulatory environments.
Yeah, they want safety.
Exactly. By domiciling the Apollo Energy platform in Delaware, Ceylon Energy is essentially importing U.S. legal certainty. They are telling global capital, your investment is governed by the predictability of Delaware corporate law, not the fluctuating policies of Colombo. It is a sophisticated financial maneuver to bypass domestic risk premiums and access global liquidity pools that would otherwise be entirely closed off to them.
I want to aggressively shift our focus now from the sophisticated financial maneuvers of the elite to the brutal, grinding reality of the systems they oversee. We have to examine the human cost when the machinery of the state fundamentally fails. And we begin with a deeply somber note.
Yes, we must impartially report the tragic passing of former Inspector General of Police, C.D. Wickramarani, at the age of 63 in a suspected suicide at his Thalahina residence. He joined the police force in 1986 and navigated decades of national turbulence, eventually serving as the 35th IGP.
It is a stark, tragic reminder of the immense, often unseen psychological toll carried by individuals at the apex of the national security apparatus.
Absolutely.
And the security and justice apparatus is under visible strain across multiple fronts. Look at the legal maneuvers currently surrounding the Easter Sunday attacks probe. We have Cardinal Malcolm Ranji filing an intervention petition to explicitly dismiss a writ petition filed by Suresh Saleh regarding the ongoing probe.
It's so tangled.
And simultaneously, a senior Buddhist monk is also seeking to intervene in these proceedings. The courts are no longer just adjudicating evidence. They are being forced to mediate between massive religious institutions and national intelligence narratives.
When you have the highest religious figures in the country filing legal interventions against intelligence officers, it signals a catastrophic collapse in institutional trust. The standard mechanisms of criminal investigation have lost credibility in the eyes of the victims' advocates.
Right. They don't trust the process.
The judiciary is being weaponized as a proxy battleground for accountability because the executive branch's investigations are perceived as inherently compromised. Every writ, every intervention, every procedural delay further entombs the truth, denying finality to a national trauma.
And procedural delay seems to be the defining characteristic of this system. We also see reports that a pre-trial conference for the high-profile money laundering case involving Yoshita Rajapaksa is merely being set for August 31st at the Colombo High Court.
Just endless delays.
We have physical, heated clashes occurring on the floor of Parliament between Jaffna District Independent MP Archituna Ramanathan and the Fisheries Minister. We see high-level administrative churn with SDIG Waruna Jayasundara being abruptly transferred to the Children and Women Affairs Division. It's a constant reactive churn that prevents any institutional stability.
It's just constant firefighting instead of actual building.
But all of that administrative dysfunction pales in comparison to this next story. This is where I want to use that paradox we opened the show with. We have an 11-year-old victim of sexual abuse who was forced to wait 22 years to finally testify in their case. The victim is now in their 30s.
That's sickening.
A 22-year wait isn't a backlog. It's not a slow clock. It is a sediment layer. It implies that the legal system is not functioning as a pipeline of justice, but as a landfill where dockets are buried under decades of administrative apathy. I have to push back on the very concept of calling this a justice system. How does a society maintain a social contract when it subjects a child victim to 2 decades of evidentiary decay and institutional attrition?
It doesn't. A 22-year delay is the functional equivalent of state-sanctioned impunity. If we look at the mechanics of how a delay like this happens, it requires failures at every single node of the network.
What goes wrong?
Everything.
Literally everything. It requires a catastrophic shortage of high court judges, a completely analog and mismanaged docketing system where physical files literally rot in basements, aggressive and unchecked delaying tactics by defense counsel exploiting procedural loopholes, and a profound lack of prioritization by the Attorney General's Department for cases involving vulnerable minors.
Wow.
When a victim has to wait 22 years, the system itself becomes the secondary abuser. The societal implication is terrifying. If the public absorbs the reality that reporting a heinous crime results in a 2-decade black hole, they will completely abandon the formal legal structure. You invite vigilantism, shadow justice, and the total erosion of the rule of law.
And that erosion of human rights within state-controlled systems doesn't stop at the courtroom doors. It penetrates deep into the penitentiary system. The Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, the HRCSL, has issued a statement expressing grave concern after being physically denied access to Welakata prison.
That's a massive red flag.
Right. Furthermore, they are demanding the state disclose the whereabouts of inmates who were abruptly transferred from Negombo prison amidst highly credible, serious allegations of violence and systemic torture.
Denying the national human rights body access to a state penitentiary is the anatomy of a cover-up. Prisons are closed, total institutions. The inmates have zero leverage and zero visibility.
They're completely at the mercy of the guards.
Exactly. The only mechanism preventing a prison from becoming a black site is unannounced, aggressive oversight by independent bodies like the HRCSL. When the Department of Prisons locks them out and moves inmates under the cloud of torture allegations without disclosing their transit locations, it implies a complete breakdown of the chain of command, or worse, state complicity in the abuse.
It's horrifying.
It mirrors the judicial collapse we just analyzed. Both are symptoms of a bureaucratic architecture that views basic human dignity as an administrative inconvenience.
It is a grim, suffocating reality. But as we transition to the physical and digital rebuilding of the nation, we encounter a jarring juxtaposition. While the prisons and courts are locked in an analog nightmare, the state is aggressively attempting to leapfrog into a digital future.
Yeah, the SLUDI project.
Right. Indian High Commissioner Santosh Shah just announced that the Sri Lanka Unique Digital Identity Project, SLUDI, is finally ready for launch. Alongside this biometric rollout, there are active plans to fully digitalize all airport services, and the Sri Lanka Accreditation Board is moving entirely to a digital framework to boost its global recognition.
This is the classic developmental leapfrog strategy. The state realizes it cannot incrementally fix the analog bureaucracy, so it attempts to bypass it entirely with digital architecture.
So just start from scratch digitally.
Yeah. SLUDI, heavily backed by Indian technical expertise, is foundational. A biometric, centralized digital identity is the prerequisite for a modern digital economy. It allows for the precise, corruption-free targeting of welfare subsidies, integrates the unbanked population into the formal financial sector, and theoretically drastically reduces the friction of interacting with the state.
Okay, that makes sense.
And digitalizing the airport and the accreditation board serves a dual purpose. It removes the human bottlenecks where bribery thrives, and it signals to foreign capital that the country is administratively modernizing.
But, and this is a massive structural but, you can build the most advanced biometric identity database in South Asia. But it is completely useless if the servers crash because you can't keep the lights on.
Right, the energy grid.
Our sources highlight a severe ongoing vulnerability in the physical grid. Specifically, the importation of substandard coal has forced a highly costly emergency shift to diesel power generation to avoid rolling blackouts. This is where the digital ambition collides violently with physical procurement failures.
Exactly. Digital infrastructure is entirely derivative of physical energy resilience. The shift from coal to diesel is a macroeconomic disaster for a country nursing its foreign reserves. Diesel generation is exponentially more expensive per megawatt hour than coal.
So who pays for that?
Well, this means the state energy utility is either absorbing massive, unsustainable fiscal losses that will eventually bleed into the sovereign debt, or they are preparing to pass those exorbitant costs directly onto the consumer, which will instantly trigger a secondary wave of inflation. It exposes a fatal flaw in state procurement protocols. Buying cheap, non-compliant coal upfront ultimately costs the state infinitely more in emergency diesel logistics.
Despite the grid vulnerabilities, there's a concerted push to pour concrete and stimulate physical movement. The Ceylon Petroleum Corporation is actively constructing 7 new oil tanks in Muthurujuela to boost capacity. The Anwilandawa Railway Substation is reopening. They've targeted 4 major infrastructure projects for completion in Kandy within the next 2 years. Even the renovation of the Independence Square walking track is commencing.
It's a lot of physical development all at once.
Now, I look at that list, and I see a mix and bag of capital allocation. Reopening a railway substation improves regional supply chain logistics. But the CPC oil tanks in Muthurujuela, that speaks directly to building a strategic petroleum reserve to buffer against the exact supply shocks we just discussed.
That is the correct analysis of the capital allocation. The Muthurujuela tanks are a national security asset designed to increase the days of fuel cover the country holds on shore, insulating the economy from spot market price spikes or shipping delays.
And the Kandy projects.
The Kandy infrastructure projects are equally vital, likely aimed at de-urbanizing the economic concentration of the Colombo core and increasing the velocity of trade and tourism in the central province. These are Keynesian injections using state or borrowed capital to build physical assets that theoretically yield a long-term economic multiplier effect.
And speaking of national security assets, Sri Lanka is reportedly eyeing the acquisition of military drones from Turkey and simultaneously announced they will host the 6th BIMSTEC Security Chiefs meeting in 2027. Moving toward Turkish drones represents a major shift in military doctrine, does it not?
It does. Turkey has disrupted the global defense market by producing highly sophisticated, combat-proven, yet relatively affordable, unmanned aerial vehicles.
So it's a cost-effective upgrade.
Very much so. For an island nation with an expansive, exclusive economic zone, shifting doctrine toward drone-centric maritime surveillance is highly cost-effective compared to maintaining a massive, aging naval fleet. It modernizes border security and anti-smuggling capabilities, which directly enhances their credibility to host regional security summits like BIMSTEC. It is a projection of modernized sovereign capability.
Now, let's bring these macro policies down to the street level, examining the daily economics of you, the listeners. The Colombo Municipal Council is slashing the entertainment tax for cinemas, sports, and concerts. This is a direct, targeted relief measure for the urban leisure economy. Concurrently, President AKD has ordered a fast-track pension scheme for Sri Lankan migrant workers. That seems like a highly strategic nod to the diaspora.
The municipal tax cut is a calculated velocity of money play. In a post-crisis environment, discretionary spending on entertainment is the first sector to contract.
Right, people stop going to the movies.
By slashing the tax burden on event organizers and venues, the city is incentivizing nightlife and cultural events, which supports a massive secondary ecosystem of gig workers, transport, and hospitality.
And what about the migrant worker pensions?
The migrant worker pension, however, is a vital macroeconomic structural reform. Remittances are the lifeblood of the Sri Lankan balance of payments. By offering a fast-tracked state pension, the government is creating a powerful long-term structural incentive for the diaspora to remit their earnings exclusively through official taxable banking channels rather than the informal shadow networks.
Now, if we look at education, we encounter a juxtaposition that is almost satirical in its contrast. We just discussed the launch of biometric digital IDs, the acquisition of advanced Turkish military drones, and the modernization of the energy sector.
Hmm.
Yet our sources indicate that China is donating the fabric required for school uniforms for the year 2027.
It's jarring.
I am genuinely stunned by the cognitive dissonance here. We are negotiating complex foreign direct investment in Delaware, but we rely on a foreign power to literally clothe our school children. However, on the administrative side of education, there are zero-cost reforms happening. National school teacher transfer applications are moving entirely online, subject-based teacher recruitment is being formalized, and a new Education Council proposal has won approval.
Your shock at the uniform donation is entirely justified, and it perfectly encapsulates the hollow nature of uneven development. A state can utilize complex financial instruments to build shiny infrastructure, but if it lacks the basic fiscal liquidity to fund the fundamental social safety net like uniforms for public school students, the recovery is fundamentally brittle.
Right.
Accepting the donated fabric from Beijing is a pragmatic necessity for a cash-starved treasury, but it is a glaring admission of localized poverty.
But the administrative side is moving forward.
However, as you noted, the administrative reforms are where true sustainable progress lies. Moving teacher transfers online destroys a massive node of localized political patronage and bribery. Subject-based recruitment ensures that the pedagogy aligns with actual academic needs rather than arbitrary placements. These administrative software updates to the education system cost very little capital but yield massive generational dividends.
Speaking of capital the state desperately needs, the data on cigarette taxes is a masterclass in fiscal negligence. According to the reports, 9.33 billion rupees in state revenue has been completely foregone lost since January 2026.
Wow.
This is because the tax share in cigarettes has steadily fallen since 2018, currently sitting at 67% of the retail price, while the World Health Organization aggressively recommends a minimum of 75%.
That's a huge gap.
9.33 billion rupees. That covers the school uniforms, that covers the digital infrastructure. Let's dig into the specific economic and public health theory here, because letting that tax share slide seems like an unforced error of epic proportions.
It is a dual failure of fiscal and public health policy rooted in the economics of price elasticity. Tobacco is a highly addictive product, meaning consumer demand is relatively inelastic. Smokers will continue to purchase cigarettes even as prices rise.
Right.
The WHO's 75% mandate is designed not just to maximize state revenue, but to push the retail price to a punitive threshold that actively forces consumers, particularly the youth, to price out of the habit.
So by dropping to 67%.
By allowing the tax burden to erode to 67%, the state is committing to catastrophic errors. First, as you noted, they are leaving nearly 10 billion rupees of desperately needed liquidity on the table, a massive opportunity cost for a bankrupt treasury.
And the second error.
Second, by failing to use taxation as a prohibitive barrier, they are essentially subsidizing present consumption, which mathematically guarantees an explosion in state healthcare expenditures over the next 2 decades as those consumers develop chronic respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. It is a policy failure that sacrifices long-term demographic health for short-term administrative inertia, or worse, industry capitulation.
And that future health expenditure is colliding with a healthcare system that is already showing bizarre, polarized extremes. If we pivot our focus to health and culture, we find a medical milestone that sounds like it was pulled from a science fiction novel. Sri Lanka just successfully completed its first AI-enabled surgery using a robotic arm.
That's incredible.
A surgeon, guided by advanced artificial intelligence algorithms, utilizing a robotic appendage to perform incredibly precise, minimally invasive procedures. It is a phenomenal leap in surgical capability.
It truly is. The integration of AI and robotics in the surgical theater drastically minimizes the margin for human error, eliminates hand tremors, and allows for micro-incisions that exponentially accelerate patient recovery times and reduce post-operative infection rates. It elevates the specific capabilities of that hospital to a globally competitive standard, potentially opening avenues for high-end medical tourism.
But I have to ground this incredible achievement in the reality of the streets outside that hospital. We have AI robots performing pristine surgeries in specialized wings, and yet, in the very same news cycle, the sources are screaming that Sri Lanka's battle with dengue fever is at a critical crossroads, with warning signs flashing red. I look at this and I have to ask, how do we possess the technological capital to deploy AI in the operating room, but lack the capacity to defeat a mosquito-borne illness in our neighborhoods?
Because they represent two fundamentally different types of problem solving. Deploying an AI robotic arm is a localized, capital-intensive solution. A private hospital or well-funded state wing can simply purchase the technology, train a small cohort of elite surgeons, and the problem is solved within those four walls.
It's just a transaction.
Exactly. Eradicating dengue fever, however, is a diffuse, systemic, population-level crisis. It cannot be solved with a single purchase order. It requires immense coordinated state capacity, rigorous urban planning, flawless municipal sanitation, persistent public education, and the behavioral modification of millions of individual citizens to eliminate stagnant water from their property.
It's much harder to scale.
Technology can cure the individual patient who can access the robotic suite, but only relentless systemic governance can cure the population of a vector-borne disease. It is the ultimate illustration of how innovation often outpaces foundational infrastructure.
And we are seeing other concerning population-level health trends that require systemic intervention. The sources note a concerning rise in HIV infections among the youth demographic. Furthermore, on the consumer protection front, the state is being forced into aggressive regulatory action.
With the milk supply, right?
Yes. The Consumer Affairs Authority has just set mandatory aflatoxin limits for processed liquid milk, effective January 2027. Concurrently, they have conducted 52 special targeted raids on private hospitals and medical labs. This looks like the state scrambling to police a rapidly expanding private sector.
The youth HIV data points to a critical lag in modernizing sexual health education curricula and adapting public health messaging to new digital social behaviors. Regarding the CAA, their aggressive posture is a direct response to the vulnerabilities in the food and health supply chains.
What exactly are aflatoxins?
Aflatoxins are highly toxic, carcinogenic compounds produced by fungi, often infiltrating the milk supply through contaminated cattle feed. Mandating stringent limits is a non-negotiable aspect of sovereign food security.
And the raids on the hospitals.
The 52 raids on private medical facilities are deeply telling. As the public healthcare system groans under the weight of fiscal constraints, the private sector is expanding rapidly to absorb the demand. However, rapid expansion often incentivizes the cutting of corners regarding diagnostic quality, sterilization protocols, and pricing transparency. The state is essentially deploying the CAA to execute a massive retroactive regulatory dragnet to ensure the private sector isn't exploiting a vulnerable populace.
Shifting our gaze to the environment and the cultural fabric, we see deliberate attempts to adapt to these systemic pressures. There's a launch of a new climate resilience program specifically designed to build inclusive, fisheries-based economies, which is incredibly pragmatic. As ocean temperatures and currents shift, the entire economic model of coastal communities has to be completely overhauled.
It's adapt or die.
We also see some vital global soft power recognition. Sri Lanka was just named among the world's top 50 food destinations.
The Fisheries Resilience Program is a vital survival mechanism. Coastal economies are the absolute front line of climate change. Traditional generational knowledge regarding fish migration patterns is becoming obsolete due to warming waters and extreme weather events.
So what does the program actually do?
This program likely focuses on injecting capital for advanced weather forecasting tech, sustainable aquaculture alternatives, and establishing microinsurance frameworks to protect fishermen from total ruin during cyclical disasters.
And the food destination ranking.
The culinary recognition is a massive strategic victory. Food diplomacy is one of the most effective tools for rebranding a nation's global image away from narratives of economic crisis and toward narratives of rich, welcoming heritage. It provides a direct stimulus to the high-value experiential tourism sector.
And that cultural heritage is operating at full throttle, regardless of the macro environment. The Kataragama Isala Mahaperhira has commenced with immense traditional grandeur. The railways have mobilized special train services to Anuradhapura to accommodate the masses for the National Pichamal Pujawa. And looking toward the commercial side of culture, the Facet's 2027 Gem and Jewelry exhibition is locked in for January. These events are the steady, resilient heartbeat of the nation.
Yeah, life goes on.
I want to pivot out of the domestic sphere on a localized story that actually carries weight. Travel vlogger Ghaffar Musafir forgot an item at the Lotus Tower. He realized it hours later, returned to the site, and incredibly, the item was recovered and returned to him through the localized lost and found. It's a tiny human moment, but broadcasted globally.
It is a microscopic event with macroeconomic PR value. In an era where digital word of mouth dictates global tourism flows, a highly visible vlogger broadcasting a genuine, unscripted moment of honesty and security at a premier national landmark does more to build institutional trust and brand equity for Sri Lanka than a $10 million state-sponsored advertising campaign. It validates the safety of the destination to the global consumer.
Okay, we're going to significantly widen our aperture now. We are zooming out from the Lotus Tower to the broader geopolitical and macroeconomic stage. Because, as we've established, the tectonic plates shifting globally will inevitably create tsunamis on our shores.
They always do.
We must begin with the deeply alarming escalation currently unfolding in the Middle East. The sources are reporting a fresh, intense wave of U.S. strikes on Iranian targets. Simultaneously, Iran is actively targeting military bases located within neighboring Gulf states. Adding highly combustible rhetoric to the kinetic action, Donald Trump has issued a stark public warning to Tehran that it better behave.
It's incredibly volatile right now.
Now, I must reiterate to you, our listener, our strict editorial parameters. We are impartially and neutrally reporting the facts on the ground as provided by international dispatches. We take no position on the conflict, we do not endorse the actions of the U.S., Iran, or the Gulf states, and we are neutrally reporting the statements of political figures like Donald Trump without endorsement or condemnation. We are strictly analyzing the blast radius of this geopolitical flashpoint.
Understood. Analyzing the strategic mechanics of this escalation, we are witnessing a severe degradation of the established deterrence frameworks in the region.
Right.
When you move past proxy skirmishes into direct reciprocal kinetic strikes between U.S. forces and Iranian assets, the strategic margin for error evaporates. Iran's decision to target installations within Gulf states is particularly destabilizing because it directly threatens the primary arteries of global energy infrastructure.
And how does that hit the listener's wallet?
Well, for an import-dependent economy like Sri Lanka, this conflict is not a distant abstraction. If hostilities force the closure or restriction of the Strait of Hormuz, the global spot price for crude oil and LNG will instantly skyrocket. That exogenous shock would immediately decimate the IMF reserve targets we discussed earlier, aggressively devalue the rupee, and inject massive, uncontrollable inflation directly into the domestic supply chain.
And the human toll of regional instability is horrifyingly evident closer to home. UN agencies are reporting the tragic disappearance of 2 refugee boats in extremely rough conditions off the coast of Myanmar. Over 500 individuals are currently unaccounted for and missing. It is a catastrophic humanitarian failure unfolding in the Bay of Bengal.
It is an absolute tragedy of unimaginable scale. It lays bare the sheer desperation of marginalized populations fleeing systemic violence in Myanmar, who calculate that risking their lives on the open, tempestuous ocean in dangerously unseaworthy vessels is a safer bet than remaining on land.
It's heartbreaking.
Furthermore, it exposes the critical lack of a cohesive, unified regional maritime search and rescue architecture, and highlights the broader impotence of international diplomacy to address the root causes of the displacement crisis at its source.
Shifting from geopolitical conflict to tectonic shifts in global finance, we have a historic move out of Asian markets. The Bank of Japan has officially raised its interest rates to 1%. That is the highest the rate has been since 1995.
Which is a huge deal.
Now, when I see the Bank of Japan raising rates, my immediate thought goes to the unwinding of the carry trade. The era of incredibly cheap yen flooding emerging markets seems to be over. Talk me through the mechanics of this capital flight.
Your intuition on the carry trade is exactly where the systemic risk lies. For decades, the Bank of Japan maintained a zero or even negative interest rate policy to combat domestic deflation.
So borrowing money was basically free.
Exactly. Global institutional investors utilized this by borrowing massive sums of yen essentially for free, converting it, and deploying that capital into high-yield, higher-risk emerging markets like Sri Lanka, Brazil, or Indonesia. This structural arbitrage flooded developing nations with vital liquidity.
But now the BOJ is hiking to 1%.
By hiking the rate to 1%, the BOJ fundamentally alters that math. Borrowing yen is no longer free. Consequently, those massive global funds immediately begin unwinding their positions. They sell off their emerging market assets, convert the local currencies back into yen, and repatriate the capital to Japan, where domestic yields are suddenly attractive and carry zero exchange rate risk.
So the money just vanishes from developing markets.
This massive, coordinated capital flight drains liquidity from emerging markets, instantly crashing their local currencies and spiking their sovereign borrowing costs. A microscopic policy adjustment in Tokyo dictates the baseline financial reality in Colombo.
That interconnectedness is staggering. Meanwhile, another Asian giant is making aggressive moves to secure its supply chain sovereignty. India just approved a massive $13.3 billion push to build a domestic semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. On top of that, the India-UK Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement (CETA) has officially come into force. India is clearly capitalizing on the China Plus One global strategy.
They are executing a masterclass in industrial policy. Semiconductors are the foundational substrate of the modern global economy. They are the critical components in everything from Sri Lanka's new digital IDs to the AI robotic surgical arms.
Right.
By injecting $13.3 billion into domestic fabrication, New Delhi is aggressively attempting to break its reliance on Taiwanese and Chinese foundries, viewing silicon sovereignty as a supreme national security imperative.
Yeah, the UK deal.
The activation of the CETA agreement with the UK is the diplomatic wing of this strategy. Post-Brexit, the UK is desperate for massive dynamic markets, and India is leveraging that desperation to secure unprecedented access for its highly skilled service sector workforce. It is cementing India's role as the indispensable economic hegemon of the region.
We also have significant social, biological, and environmental shifts occurring globally. In Europe, after years of agonizing societal and ethical debate, French MPs have officially approved an assisted dying law governed by incredibly strict medical rules. In the United States, Pete Hegseth announced that the U.S. military is going to commence mandatory screening of personnel for testosterone deficiency. And in South Asia, Pakistan is once again submerged in an endless monsoon crisis, raising profound questions about the state's total lack of preparedness for these cyclical disasters.
These three data points illustrate how different states are reacting to biological and environmental stress. The French legislation is a stark attempt to navigate the complex bioethics and resource allocation of a rapidly aging demographic, legally defining the boundaries of human autonomy at the end of life.
And the military screening.
The U.S. military's focus on endocrinological screening signals a pivot toward optimizing the physiological baseline and combat readiness of its force amid escalating global tensions and domestic recruitment shortfalls.
But Pakistan's monsoon crisis feels like a whole different level of stress.
But Pakistan is the most urgent warning. When monsoons are described as endless and the national infrastructure is annihilated on an annual basis, we can no longer classify this as an unforeseen natural disaster. It is a chronic, catastrophic failure of state climate adaptation. It is a preview of the systemic collapse that awaits any coastal or agrarian nation, Sri Lanka included, that fails to rapidly climate-proof its infrastructure.
We are entering the final phase of our deep dive today, moving into the bizarre, the future, and the absolute pinnacle of human competition. We are looking at the intersections of biology, advanced technology, and peak emotional drama.
My favorite part.
Starting with biology, the natural world proves it still has secrets hidden from our satellites. Researchers have just discovered a completely new species of monkey, characterized by striking bright orange lips, hiding deep within the dense, undocumented forests of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Wow.
On the complete opposite end of the value spectrum, in the realm of synthetic pop culture mythology, the original prop dragon eggs utilized in the filming of the series Game of Thrones are heading to auction, expected to fetch astronomical sums.
It is a brilliant, almost tragic juxtaposition of modern human values. The discovery in the DR Congo is a humbling reminder that the biosphere remains vast and critically underexplored, highlighting the desperate need for conservation funding in the Congo Basin before these uncatalogued ecosystems are logged into oblivion.
And then there are the fake dragon eggs.
Conversely, the auctioning of the dragon eggs demonstrates how our highly financialized society assigns immense liquid capital value to the physical artifacts of our shared digital entertainment. We will eagerly bid millions for a polyurethane prop of a mythical creature while struggling to fund the protection of newly discovered, actual living species.
And speaking of creating synthetic entities, we must discuss a video out of China that has set the tech world on fire. It features a highly realistic humanoid robot operating on the street, essentially begging from pedestrians. It is incredibly lifelike and has ignited a massive global debate regarding AI ethics.
It's wild.
The prompt explicitly asks us to pose a philosophical question here, and I want to push this to its logical extreme. We understand programming a machine to assemble a car or perform a surgery. But what happens to the social fabric when we program machines not just to simulate empathy, but to actively, algorithmically manipulate human emotion to extract a desired outcome, like money or data?
You are identifying the exact threshold where technology transitions from a tool into a psychological weapon. Empathy is an evolutionary biological response designed to foster cooperation and bind human communities together in the face of adversity.
Okay.
If developers program an AI housed in a humanoid chassis to mimic destitution, to hold out a trembling hand, to utilize specific vocal cadences engineered to trigger human pity, they are executing a sophisticated hack on human evolutionary psychology.
That's terrifying.
The ethical implications are terrifying. If we permit the deployment of emotion-manipulating AI in public spaces, we run the risk of emotionally bankrupting the populace. If you are constantly bombarded by synthetic suffering designed to exploit your empathy, the human brain will eventually adapt by shutting that empathy down. We risk creating a society that becomes entirely desensitized and apathetic to actual biological human suffering.
That is a profoundly chilling trajectory. From the manipulation of synthetic emotion, we move to the most raw, unfiltered display of human emotion on the planet, the sports desk. The narratives leading up to the 2026 World Cup final are nothing short of legendary. We have Lionel Messi and Argentina clawing their way to the final for an ultimate showdown with Spain. Messi has been operating with a ferocious defiance, publicly hitting back at his critics by stating, "Nobody gave us anything."
He's on a mission.
And the intensity isn't confined to the sport itself. Argentina is currently facing disciplinary fines from FIFA for parading a Falklands banner during their semi-final victory celebrations. Now, maintaining our strict geopolitical neutrality regarding historical territorial disputes, the injection of that specific national grievance onto the global sporting stage is incredibly explosive.
Analyzing this strictly through the lens of sports psychology and narrative architecture, it is the perfect storm. You have Messi, arguably the defining player of his century, operating in the absolute twilight of his career, refusing to succumb to the dying of the light. His assertion that nobody gave us anything is the classic deployment of a siege mentality. Elite managers and captains manufacture this psychological construct, the idea that the entire world is actively against them, to forge an unbreakable tribal bond within the locker room.
And the Falklands banner.
The incident with the Falklands banner perfectly illustrates how the World Cup operates as a proxy for geopolitical conflict. The players are consciously intertwining their athletic struggle with deeply embedded national identity and historical grievances. The pitch ceases to be a grass field and becomes a theater for national vindication.
The gauntlet they ran to get here was pure chaos. Argentina had to survive a grueling 3-2 edge over Egypt. We saw Switzerland completely stun Colombia, eliminating them on penalties in a massive upset.
That was a crazy game.
But it's the psychological collapse of the European giants that is most fascinating.
Sure.
Following their elimination of the U.S., the Belgian camp posted a highly aggressive, taunting, "Overturn this message." Then we have the absolute meltdown of the English squad.
Oh, man.
The so-called Blue Thunder struck England, knocking them out, but not before Jude Bellingham was involved in a physical altercation, slapping an Argentina substitute in a prior scuffle. It culminated in Prince William having to issue a public statement telling the English squad to hold their heads high. And perhaps the most shocking tactical collapse, the total dismantling and fall of the France fortress.
What you are describing is the unique, highly volatile ecosystem of a World Cup tournament. The established tactical hierarchies, like the highly favored France fortress, frequently disintegrate not because of a lack of talent, but because they cannot process the crushing, suffocating weight of national expectation.
So it's all mental at that point.
Conversely, teams that manage to weaponize their emotion and maintain absolute tactical discipline like Switzerland, or an aggrieved Argentina, manage to thrive in the chaos. The incidents involving Belgium's aggressive social media post and Bellingham's physical loss of control are acute symptoms of psychological overload. These athletes are operating under unmanageable levels of stress, carrying the vicarious hopes of millions. By the latter stages of the tournament, physical conditioning is secondary. Success is entirely dictated by mental endurance and emotional regulation.
We see the exact same burden of expectation and the incredible catharsis of overcoming it mirrored in our local sports triumphs. Yevon David has galvanized the entire nation by successfully flying the Sri Lankan flag on the F3 podium. It is a phenomenal, barrier-breaking achievement in global motorsport. We also have the Sri Lankan contingent actively competing and representing the nation at the Asian age group diving event.
It's a great moment for local sports.
However, we must also acknowledge the administrative foundation of these successes by mourning the sad passing of the former Sri Lanka National Olympic Committee head, Suresh Subramaniam, a figure who dedicated his career to building the very infrastructure these athletes rely upon.
The loss of Suresh Subramaniam is a deep blow to the structural framework of Sri Lankan sports. Athletes do not reach global podiums in a vacuum. They require the invisible, bureaucratic architecture of committees and funding that figures like him fight to maintain.
Yeah, you don't see the work behind the scenes.
Exactly. If we draw a thematic line connecting Lionel Messi's defiant siege mentality on the global stage to Yevon David's historic F3 podium, we see the universal psychology of the underdog. For David to secure an F3 podium hailing from a nation with virtually zero domestic motorsport infrastructure requires an incomprehensible level of logistical maneuvering, financial sacrifice, and psychological fortitude.
They both carry that weight.
Both athletes carry the heavy burden of elevating their respective nations' narratives, and when they succeed, they provide a rare, unifying release for a public that is otherwise navigating the immense daily frictions we've discussed throughout this hour.
What an absolute marathon of a deep dive this has been today. We have traversed an incredible amount of terrain, and I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for engaging with this complex matrix of information. We began by analyzing the shifting tectonic plates of political mandates and the brutal macroeconomic realities of IMF reserve targets and currency depreciation. We stared into the abyss of a 22-year delay in the justice system, and then immediately pivoted to the digital leaps of biometric identities and the futuristic reality of AI-assisted robotic surgery.
It's been a lot.
We tracked the global shockwaves of Japanese interest rate hikes, the tragedy of climate-driven monsoons, and ultimately arrived at the peak emotional theater of the World Cup and the terrifying ethical frontier of humanoid robots.
It is a massive volume of data to synthesize. But if there is a singular overarching thesis I want you to walk away with, it is the profound intersection of all these seemingly disparate threads. We have spent an hour marveling at the capacity of AI to perform pristine medical procedures and debating the terrifying implications of algorithms engineered to mimic human poverty on the streets.
Right. Yet these breathtaking technological leaps exist on the exact same timeline, in the exact same society, where an 11-year-old victim was abandoned by the state, forced to wait 22 agonizing years just for a human judge to open their file.
It's hard to reconcile.
As we aggressively pursue digital modernization, as we encode our identities into biometric databases, and as we look outward to claim our space in the Indian Ocean century, we are confronted by a foundational question. Are we investing equivalent capital, energy, and urgency into upgrading our basic humanity, our institutional empathy, and our fundamental systems of justice? Or are we simply building faster, smarter, more efficient machines to operate within a deeply broken world?
That is the defining question of our generation. Thank you for diving into the depths with us today. Remember to always look past the headlines, question the underlying mechanics, and we will see you next time right here on the RTV Global Network.